Hello there, and welcome to our brand new series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. Such was the success of our Exploring the Cotswolds series that we decided to look at the region from a slightly different perspective. We're going to seek out small villages, lesser-known buildings, sometimes even small artifacts. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. You find Ross, Widget and me today in the wonderful village of Winchcombe. We're out on the western escarpment of the Cotswolds, looking at what is quite clearly one of the most beautiful towns in the whole area. Some of you will remember that we've been here before. A few years ago, we were followed Evans into Winchcombe from Stanway, and we came up the high street as far as the pub, where we stopped and had a coffee. We never made it as far as this amazing church, which has a fantastic story to tell. We're going to show you around, tell you a little bit about the history, and then we're going to take you a little bit deeper into the dim distant past when there was an abbey, a huge abbey, just behind this church, which was of course sacked at the time of Henry VIII. Come with me. We're starting this episode of Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds by doing something a little unusual for us. We're returning to film a little more about a town we visited before. Partly because we missed lots of lovely things the first time round, but also because this wonderful medieval town, the home of the Anglo-Saxon kings of Mercia, the centre of wonderful legends of deceit and villainy, is the perfect starting off point for your journey along the western escarpment of the Cotswolds to Broadway. When we first came here, we were following in the footsteps of Herbert Evans, our trusted 19th century friend and guide, and I for one found myself rather falling for this beautiful ancient town. He led us to approach it uphill from the north, and we only managed to get as far as the pub. There may be a lesson there about our priorities. However, it meant we never got to the church of St. Peter that stands proudly on the hill opposite Sudeley Castle. Topped by its enormous gilded wooden cockerel, brought in 1874 all the way from St. Mary Redcliffe in Bristol, St. Peter's is not a hugely elaborate church, but a dignified building in the Perpendicular style, its remodelling dating from around 1460 to 70. When you enter the building, the first thing that hits you is the busy atmosphere. There's almost always a volunteer on duty to show you round the treasures to be found in the church and to give you a rundown on its history. There are so many churches in the area that have a feeling of desolation about them despite their beauty that it's refreshing to meet such enthusiasm. They will show you the ancient altar cloth, made up of priests' copes from around 1380, reassembled as an altar cloth in the early 16th century, which shows the pomegranate badge of Catherine of Aragon, the pretty wine-glass-shaped pulpit of around 1895, and the chandelier donated in 1753 and made locally. The stained glass is impressive with some 15th century fragments, a terrific east window from about 1885 by Hardman, and two early 19th century figures in the north clerestory brought from Sudeley Castle in 1878. At the back of the church is a model, built recently to give an idea of the enormous scale of the monastery and abbey that used to sit behind this church, but was entirely destroyed at the dissolution. This story we told last time we visited. Outside the church there are some wonderful gargoyles, some of which are probably comical representations of the master masons who carved them, and others more clearly of the church benefactors from the family at Sudeley. On the eastern wall there are some poignant reminders of the instability of our society, frighteningly relevant today. There are bullet scars in the stonework, remnants of the street fighting that took place here during the Civil War. Nothing changes. We're dropping now down to the bottom of the valley, crossing the River Isbourne and climbing the slope of the Cotswold opposite, heading down tiny single-track roads for a little hamlet of 3 or 4 houses, a barn or 2, and a tiny church. We're in the little village of Farmcote, and we've been following Evans all the way along this western escarpment, and he describes the journey up a hill pushing his bike. And I'm going to read it to you because it is so extraordinary. It says as follows: "The ruts and rough grass as I climb and ascent through a cornfield require careful steering and keep my eyes fixed upon the ground. On raising them again, the scene disclosed is positively startling. Without being aware of it, I have reached the brow of the steep western face of the hills, and there on the horizon stands the blue undulating chain of the Malvern Range in all its grandeur. To the northwest appear the distant Shropshire heights, while the middle distance is filled by Bredon, with Dumbleton Hill like an outpost planted in front of it." Behind me, people, you see what he saw. It is just incredible. It's very likely that you'll never come to this little hamlet. It's extremely remote, minute, and at the end of a single-track road with no passing places or anywhere to park a vehicle. I'm afraid that unless you're on foot or on a bicycle, you'll have to make do with films and photos like this one. It was ever thus. Around 1,000 years ago, this little community was given what was described as a chapel of ease. Built probably by the early Normans, possibly even by the late Saxons, this little building allowed the residents of this hamlet to attend church without having to make the arduous and possibly dangerous journey to their local parish church in Guyting Power, 4 or 5 miles away. Dedicated to St. Faith, it's a fully fledged church, but in miniature. It's full of treasures. The communion rail is 17th century and almost certainly came from Winchcombe Church. The wonderful medieval roof of ancient oak beams. The charming bellcut, once a double peal, but now just a single bell, touchingly poised inside the nave to summon the village to church. The altar stone, a 13th century mensa, is an extremely rare survivor of the Reformation. It must have been removed, hidden and replaced once sanity was restored. There's even a lovely canopied tomb featuring the effigies of Henry and Mary Stratford, dressed in full Elizabethan garb and probably dating from around 1590. They show signs of having been cut down to size, suggesting that they were made somewhere else by someone who couldn't believe the tiny space into which they were to be squeezed. Now, I'm not really a religious man, and I try to avoid excessive sentimentality, but this place really does tug on my heartstrings. Way back in the mid-1950s, I came here with my older brother, Julian, on the back of his Lambretta motor scooter. We'd been fossil hunting in the quarries that are dotted around this edge of the Cotswold escarpment, and dropped in here for a break to eat our sandwiches. 8 years older than me, it was here that he explained to me the way in which a sounding board, the roof over the amazing little pulpit, enhanced the sound of the preacher's voice, and how the floor over a large hollow cavity had the same effect with the bass notes. He likened it to the effect of a tea-chest bass, a rudimentary musical instrument used in my recently formed school skiffle group. We had 2 ukuleles, a washboard, and said tea chest. We were only 8 years old, and the bassist had to stand on top of the chest to play it. Those trips with my brother to the Cotswold churches undoubtedly sowed the seeds of my fascination with the area. So it could easily be said that my brother Julian is responsible for this whole explorer thing, and for that I can't thank him enough. A musician, publisher and writer, he was an inspirational man. He died last year after a terrible, decade-long struggle with dementia, and visiting this place has finally allowed me to remember him as he was before that dreadful illness took him from us. Descending from Farmcote through the wood, we find ourselves in a green coombe, shut in by hills on all sides except the north. On our right is the Parish Church. In the meadow on our left, a square plot enclosed by 4 ruined walls. This is the cloister garth of the once famous Cistercian monastery of Hales. Nothing else remains. The splendid church, the conventual buildings, the approaches, the gatehouse, the precinct walls, all have gone. There is nothing above ground but these ruined walls to tell of the vast edifice of which they once formed so small a part. A few years would suffice for the destruction of all that for 3 centuries had been the object of veneration. Neither here nor at Winchcombe, 2 miles away, was it any outburst of popular fanaticism or any violent manifestation of popular hostility that overthrew the shrines and pulled down the walls of these 2 magnificent churches. The demolition was deliberate and systematic. It was a mere matter of business proceeding upon a cool calculation of profit and loss. That these buildings were landmarks in the history of the national church, that they were the supreme efforts of constructive art, was quite beside the question. It was enough that on utilitarian grounds they stood condemned. Neither of them was needed, either for a cathedral, as at Gloucester, or for a parish church, as at Tewkesbury. Why then should they any longer cumber the ground? Rather let them be swept away at once, and their materials put to some more profitable use. So, at any rate, thought the man who was responsible for their destruction. Thomas, Lord Seymour of Sudeley, Lord High Admiral of England, and brother-in-law of the King. Both abbeys had been granted to him at the dissolution in 1539, and he was not the man to lose any time in making the most of his acquisition. It would no doubt be unfair to condemn him on this count alone. 9 out of 10 men in his day, estimable citizens enough according to their lights, would have done the same, but for Thomas Seymour it is impossible on any count to feel either sympathy or respect. So thoroughly were his orders in each case carried out that not a single stone of either church remains, and it has been only in recent years that excavations have discovered their foundations and given us indisputable evidence of their former splendour. The small parish church of Hales stands close beside the abbey. Originally built in the 12th century, it passed on the foundation of the monastery into the possession of the monks, and was much altered by them. The fragments of the original church which remain are the shafts of the chancel arch and the 2 pilasters which support the south chancel wall. Driving northwards along the road that follows the base of the hills towards our next destination of Stanway, we're following the tracks of the Heritage Railway that runs from Cheltenham to Broadway. We hope to visit this terrific railway at a later date to enjoy the nostalgia of steam trains in more detail. Crossing the railway at Toddington Station, a 1/4 mile climb up the hill brings us to the little turning left to Stanway, our next destination. At this junction is an amazing war memorial. Built in 1920, this extraordinary bronze of St. George and the Dragon was made by Alexander Fisher, placed on a stone column and plinth by Sir Philip Stott. The lettering by Eric Gill is elegant and refined. This is a truly exceptional piece of statuary and remarkable to find in such an isolated piece of countryside. Behind me you'll see the most incredible entranceway to an ancient house built behind it many centuries ago. We're in a place called Stanway. It's hidden away in this wonderful place. There's a mill we're going to show you, it's glorious streets. Part of the wonders of this place is that it was owned for many years by one man who made certain that the village was never spoiled. Let's show you around. Stanway is a truly extraordinary village. It's been in the hands of only two families since the 16th century, and therein, of course, lies its secret. No one has been able to develop this village into something for which it wasn't designed. The Tracy family owned a lease on the estate since the dissolution of the monasteries, before which it was part of the Tewkesbury Abbey estate. The Tracy family built this wonderful Jacobean mansion over generations. In 1620, Richard Tracy built the gatehouse outside which Ross and I found ourselves, frankly, transfixed. In 1817, the house passed through the Charteris female line into the possession of the Weems family, and in 1859 they carried out several improvements and additions to the house. The Weems family still own this extraordinary place. They're a noble Scottish family and own several other great houses in Britain, but it is enormously to their credit that they've kept this exceptional place pretty much as it was since the start. Just the church, the huge and beautiful Jacobean house with its superb gatehouse, a few cottages and barns all faced in a wonderful golden ashlar stone, and a recently restored working watermill is pretty much all the village consists of. The church is a trifle disappointing when you go inside. It's pretty enough, but all decoration has been stripped, and quite a lot of 15th and 19th century alterations have largely hidden the obviously substantial 12th century original. Nevertheless, it's well worth a visit, not least because the best view of the house, except on those days when it's open to the public, is to be had from the churchyard. The pulpit, made of nice 17th century panels, is lovely to see, and a super brass lectern looks as though it may be a survivor from the Reformation. Perhaps they hid it somewhere during that iconoclastic time and brought it out again when it was all over. Just north of the house is a cricket field, provided for the village, complete with thatched pavilion. It was built by John Oakey of Winchcombe on behalf of Sir James Barry, a friend of the Weems family and author of Peter Pan. Behind the house, a water garden was created in 2004 with a quite extraordinary fountain. Closed at the moment because of the pandemic, we didn't see the fountain working, but it is the highest single-jet fountain in Britain, reaching 300 feet into the sky. It's the tallest gravity-powered fountain in the world, fed from a 100,000-gallon reservoir high in the hills through a 2-kilometre-long 12-inch pipe terminating in a bronze nozzle just 2 inches in diameter. The only fountain in Europe higher than this one is the turbine-powered fountain in Lake Geneva. Just round the corner from the gatehouse is this incredible working watermill. Restored and working since 2009, this mill produces fantastic stone-ground bread flour. We were lucky enough to arrive on a day when the mill was working, and the lovely millers were generous enough to sell me a bag of flour for the slightly measly £2 I had in my pocket. A bag is usually a few pence more than that, but I can tell you from experience that a loaf made 50-50 wholemeal and strong white flour produces spectacularly tasty bread. I think the message from Stanway is that if you leave this wonderful heritage of ours alone, protect it from the ravages of the recent centuries, maintain its solidly built infrastructure, it rewards you with a sense of peace and warm-heartedness that is simply unique and staggeringly valuable. So few of these villages are treasured and protected like this. I left with a mixture of sublime joy and deep dread that over the next century even this wonderful place will be destroyed by the Philistine obsession modern mankind has with money. Let's hope I'm wrong. I do hope you've loved discovering this wonderful place of Stanway with us today. It's been such fun, despite the freezing weather. Continuing north from Stanway through beautiful parkland and avenues, we head for our next destination, the little village of Stanton. This is a larger settlement, but is just as unspoiled and beautiful, which is a relief, really, because Evans, when he travelled through this part of the world, recommended very much that we visit these villages, suggesting that we may not have much opportunity to do so in the future. Because when he was moving around this area, just at the turn of the last century, the railway was about to be built. And he expressed some considerable reservations about it. I'll read it briefly. He says, "The villages just mentioned are all secluded and unspoilt, and for 2 or 3 centuries have worn much the same aspect that they do today. But a time of probation is approaching. The new railway will soon be open. And then? ? But I will not forestall the date of grief. They are all built of the good local stone and are built to last." The railway of which he speaks is just across the fields down there, is now a heritage railway. We see it as part of ancient history, and it certainly has not spoiled these beautiful villages. Come with us, this little turmoil of dogs behind me, and let's go and visit this beautiful, extraordinary village of Stanton. This little village of Stanton is just 3.5 miles southwest of Broadway. It sits on the very edge of the western escarpment of the Cotswolds, and like its neighbour Stanway, epitomises the unchanged beauty of this extraordinary region. Those of us who mind a great deal about the conservation of the Cotswolds talk a lot about the way in which the tin-eared developers and their ilk are slowly destroying the ancient beauty of this extraordinary place. But once in a while, we come across somewhere that shows just how it's still possible to hold back the tide of brutal, ugly modernity, and we celebrate. The irony is that Herbert Evans, whose guide, written in 1905, many of you will know we've been following for some years, and with whom I find myself developing an ever-increasing empathy, was talking exactly the same language 120 years ago. And yet some of these places remain pretty much unchanged. Perhaps we're a little too pessimistic, even underestimating the sensibilities of the local authorities and rampaging property developers. I wonder. Stanton Church, dedicated to St. Michael and originally built by the monks of Winchcombe in the 12th century, retains its Norman arcade on the north side of the nave, but the rest is of a later date. The fine, embattled western tower, with its pretty recessed ribbed spire, and the porch, with an old statue recess in the wall containing a modern image of St. Michael, and an upper chamber above the door, give this church the impression of splendour and style. But perhaps its most interesting features lie in its furnishings, many of which are early 20th century. The rood screen was made by Sir Ninian Comper in 1917 and forms a spectacular border at the end of the nave. The font is a great example of the usual 15th century octagonal design. And a very early 14th century pulpit, now used as a lectern, is unusual because at that time they didn't usually preach from a pulpit, preferring the more public village cross. The newer pulpit, from which sermons are given today, was built in the Georgian style, using panels from the late 17th century and a recently donated pair of modern brass candlesticks. The east window, so spectacular to see now, contains sections of glass from the Cistercian monastery at Hales Abbey, demolished in the mid-16th century and ruthlessly looted for its building materials. Tiny surviving fragments of the abbey still used for their original purpose. This little church introduces this traveller to an architectural feature called a squint. There are two in this church, little passages through the thick walls that allow people sitting in the transepts to see what's going on by the altar. One is a full passage which you can walk through, and the other a hole in the wall at eye level for those sitting in the pews. A brilliant solution that I will now look out for in other buildings. The organ loft, also added by Sir Ninian Comper in 1918, gives the organist a terrific traditionally mirrored view of his congregation. The church benefited enormously from the arrival in the village of Sir Philip Stott, who bought Stanton Court in 1906. He commissioned Sir Ninian Comper to restore the church, which he did with great sensitivity. Stott, an architect by profession, also restored a great many of the houses in the village that had become extremely dilapidated following several decades of agricultural depression. It's part of his legacy that the gently sloping High Street is still lined with distinguished stone cottages. The village cross, just at the bottom of the lane that leads to the church, has a lovely little sundial let into its top southern facade, still as good a way for the villagers to check on the time as ever it was, at least when the sun's shining. On the northwestern edge of the village are some houses that epitomise the conflict there so often can be between those of us who really want to protect the beauty of this region and those whose priorities lie elsewhere. In the late 1940s, some social housing was built by the local authority. 4 new homes, built to the west of the village by Cheltenham Rural District Council, to be named Wedgwood Cottages, thus preserving the name of Miss Eliza Wedgwood, the daughter of a much-admired local rector. During the Festival of Britain in 1951, the cottages won special praise as fine examples of rural housing. It's really hard not to feel that brilliant, affordable houses built in the vernacular contribute so very much better to the local community than scrappy little boxes thrown up by profit-motivated developers. Will we ever learn? Ross and I stopped off at the pub, the Mount Inn, right at the top of the village, despite COVID restrictions, and had a delicious lunch with these wonderful views over the Vale. Hospitable, friendly, and I'm sure very grateful for your business. So come to this village. It's an excellent example of what Cotswold villages should look and feel like. But don't come in your hundreds. It's really not suitable for coaches or caravans. I guess if I had my way, I'd restrict access to horse-drawn carriages, but hey, I'm an old man. But I may see you there. The next settlement on this lovely trip along the western escarpment of the Cotswolds is the small village of Buckland. This manor used to belong to St. Peter's Abbey in Gloucester before the dissolution, and the church behind me is of a great interest. There's quite a lot of very old stuff still inside it, and we're going to show it to you. I particularly like the gargoyles on the top of the tower. It's a great little village, this, very unspoiled, and as we mentioned in Stanton, we were warned by Evans that the railway, only a matter of a couple of miles from here, less than a mile from here, was going to ruin, he really was concerned it was going to ruin these places. Well, it certainly hasn't. They are absolutely peaceful and lovely. Behind this church is the Manor House, which is now a hotel, and we will show you that too. The name Buckland is a common one round here, and it simply means bookland or land held by charter or book. In this case, as I've already mentioned, by the Abbey of Gloucester. The little settlement snuggles in the folds of the hills with all the drowsiness you could hope for from a remote country village. The hills rise up from the small group of houses, giving them a green backdrop with a fringe of trees at the top. These slopes play with your sense of perspective and give the little place a gentle kind of enveloped feeling. There are 3 important buildings in the village, the first of which, the old rectory, is now a private house. It was probably built by William Grafton, who was rector here from 1466 to 1510. The church sits on the top of a small hillock in the centre of the village, and is full of interesting things. The panelling on the walls is early 17th century work, as appears from the following inscription: Thomas Izzard and James Southern, of their own charge, have given this wainscot and benching to church in the year of our Lord 1615. At Buckland, evidently, the yeomen had not by that time ceased to take pride in their parish church, or to be able and willing to spend their money on it. The font, as we have so often seen in this area, is an octagonal design, and it has lovely carved decoration, more complex than many. Looking up at the organ loft, we can see where the roof was raised to give the church the clerestory in the 15th century. And turning to the eastern wall, the terrific reredos carved in 1921 in Arts and Crafts Byzantine style by Musgrave & Co., to the design of Alexander Fisher. Above it, in the east window, are 3 painted glass panels, much older than the stonework and possibly gifted to the church by William Grafton in the 1500s. This glass was restored by William Morris himself at cost price in about 1883. Lovely though the painted glass is, for me, one of the greatest charms of this church is the nearly clear glass in the majority of the windows. Extremely ancient and imperfect, but letting in the light and the blurred images of the trees blowing in the wind outside. Nothing creates for me a more relaxed and cosy atmosphere. The wonderful floors have some original 15th century tiles in the south aisle, and the rest are great copies made in the late 19th century. In the west end of the north aisle there are 3 mutilated carved stone fragments with painted angels. They were found in the rectory, and it is possible that they're remnants of a 15th century reredos at Hales Abbey. It is both cheering that remnants of that incredible monastery still appear, and devastating to think of what once was. Just a few yards from the church is the old manor house. Buckland Manor is a mixture of 17th century building and late 19th century additions, making it a bit of a rambling place without great architectural structure, but perfectly suited to its current use as an hotel. Ross and I found it irresistible and decided to visit for a coffee. We don't often comment on local businesses, but we really did enjoy this place. They were extremely welcoming, despite our camera equipment and slightly dishevelled appearance, and treated us to a comforting experience that took me way back. There are some rather old-fashioned ideas of service, decor, even crockery in this hotel. For me, it was lovely to be waited on by black waistcoated young men who clearly took pride in their highly skilled jobs. Coffee from a lovely coffee pot, elegant cups and saucers, the whole thing. We were certainly not there long enough to give a proper evaluation of this place, but what we saw we thoroughly enjoyed. And I have a feeling I might be bringing my wife here for the weekend soon. Always assuming they'll accept dogs. Can't leave Widget and Gizmo behind. If I do come, I'll let you know and fill you in on the details. I do hope you've enjoyed our visit to Buckland as much as I have. This wonderful, peaceful place in the folds of the hills. It's so pretty, it really is. From Buckland, it's only a short trip to the famous and extremely popular village of Broadway, which we visited a few years ago and shot the following film. Now, Broadway is smaller than most of the other famous Cotswold towns, and it's right at the northern tip of the region. In fact, we're actually in Worcestershire, but we're surrounded on three sides by the rather more familiar Cotswold county of Gloucestershire. It's mainly famous for its beautiful high street, lined with chestnut trees and these golden, beautiful Cotswold stone buildings, and a plethora of shops, pubs, cafes and hotels. It's frankly worth visiting Broadway just for the high street. However, there are various other things for which Broadway is justifiably famous. We're going to show you around, and I know that you, along with all the artists, musicians, writers and craftsmen who discovered Broadway before you, will be utterly captivated by its beauty. Follow me. Filming as we are at 5 a.m. on a summer's day, you get a feeling for what it was that first attracted the group who became known as the Broadway Group to this pretty Worcestershire village. The rose-coloured buildings, mostly built with stone from the quarries on Broadway Hill to the south of us, give one an extraordinary sense of peace. The early morning sounds of the milkman making his deliveries, the delicatessen owner stacking his fresh produce onto ancient wooden market barrows and displaying them in front of his shop, and a small band of men in the apparently obligatory bright yellow coats picking up any detritus left from the previous day. This peaceful scene is probably as close as we'll get to that which Francis Millet, an expat American painter and illustrator, happened upon in the mid-1880s. It was perfect timing on Millet's part, for a fashion was developing in England for artists to gather in groups and form colonies, away from the smelly, noisy and generally uninspiring life in the cities. They could be found in Cornwall, Yorkshire and Suffolk, as well as here in Broadway. Millet, a man blessed with some private wealth, first acquired Farnham House in Broadway to live in with his family, and shortly afterwards, when it became obvious that he would be joined by many of his creative friends, he bought an old monastic ruin called Abbott's Grange, which he restored just enough to turn it into a studio where they could all work. Into this idyllic environment came the painters John Singer Sargent, Edwin Abbey, Alfred Parsons, also a well-known garden designer and illustrator, George Borton, Edwin Blashfield, the English illustrator Fred Barnard, and the writers Henry James and Edmund Goss. An impressive group, if ever there was one. Goss wrote of the Grange at the time, "A medieval ruin, a small ecclesiastical edifice, which was very roughly repaired so as to make it a kind of refuge for us. And there, in the morning, Henry James and I would write, while Abbey and Millet painted on the ground floor below, and Sargent and Parsons tilted their easels just outside. We were all within shouting distance, and not much serious work was done, for we were in towering spirits, and everything was food for laughter. Henry James was the only sedate one of all, benign, indulgent but grave, and not often unbending beyond a genial chuckle. It does seem Henry James was the only calming influence amongst this rather rowdy group, and it's not clear how much of an influence he really had. In the best tradition of artistic communities, they were a lively and colourful bunch, confident in the value of creative life and the contribution they would make to the rest of the world. They were certainly not great contributors to the peace and tranquillity of Broadway. Edmund Goss also wrote, Nothing we do scandalises the villagers. Fred Barnard, with an enormous stage slouch hat over his shoulders, chased one of the Americans down the street. The man chased, screaming all the time and trying to escape up lampposts and down wells. Not a villager smiled. Whatever we do or say, wear or sing, they only say, "Them Americans is out again." Now fully restored, the Grange is an extremely upmarket B&B, surely worth a visit. Towards the end of the 19th century, this community, like all those before and after, started to wear out. It's an inevitability that such passion and enthusiasm will wilt with time, but the legacy these young, rebellious and hugely creative people left behind is seen in the eyes of those thousands of people from all round the world who visit this village each year. The group dispersed. Abby bought a property in Fairford, south of here, and was followed by Sargent and eventually Henry James. Millet was later to die in the Titanic disaster in 1912. Originally a manor house, the Ligon Arms behind me was first registered as an inn in 1532 when it was known as the White Hart. Later in the 1800s it was renamed the Ligon Arms after an Edward Ligon, who was a distinguished local landowner and soldier who commanded the 2nd Life Guards at the Battle of Waterloo. In 1904, the hotel was taken over by an S.B. Russell, whose son Gordon was to become one of the country's greatest designers. Just round the corner there's a museum dedicated to his work, some incredible furniture, taking us through all the various styles of the 20th century. The hotel has a remarkable history. Charles I stayed here twice, and Oliver Cromwell is known to have slept here as well. It's passed through many hands, varying in their approach to the business. It just happens to be one of only 2 places in the country from which I have been ejected for wearing inappropriate dress. It's quite nice to get my own back. For Mr. Russell, it was an exciting business to take on. His young son Gordon, however, had other plans. Once again, the inspirational beauty of the village asserted its influence on the artistic mind, and when his father took on the Ligon Arms in 1904, he is unlikely to have thought he was arriving in the village that would inspire him to huge success in his field. He became, however, perhaps the most influential furniture designer of the 20th century. He fell under the influence of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, who were often in and around Broadway at the time, particularly at Broadway Tower, which we will visit in a moment, and later was instrumental in the vital utility furniture program after the Second World War, replacing the nation's destroyed possessions with affordable but elegant furniture. He also designed the famous chairs on which the congregation sit in the new Coventry Cathedral, built after the original building was totally destroyed in the war. Inside the Russell Museum, his likeness is immortalised in bronze by the renowned sculptor Alan Thornhill. Struggling up the escarpment to the south of the town on a road called Fish Hill, it becomes clear why Broadway became a coaching stop for those travelling between Worcester and Oxford. The hill is extremely steep and would have required fresh horses to tackle it. Way up on the hill above Broadway is the Broadway Tower, which you see behind me. The original concept for this extraordinary building was had by Capability Brown, the famous 18th century landscape architect. It was put into practice by the 6th Earl of Coventry, who commissioned an architect called James Wyatt to design and build this rather remarkable small castle. It has a wonderful history. It was used by William Morris and his business as a retreat, and many other artists came here. We'll tell you a little bit about it as we look around. The tower has been inspirational for a variety of creative people. Thomas Phillips had his early printing press here. He was one of the greatest ever collectors of books and manuscripts. Many of the arts and crafts movement used the building as a kind of 19th century holiday let. The Pre-Raphaelite artists Dante Gabriel Rossetti Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris himself were frequent visitors, and it was here that Morris began his campaign for the preservation of historic monuments. Actually, hang on a minute, I remember saying something similar about the church in Burford. Perhaps it's slightly tricky to be completely certain where these things started. It has, however, one of the most extraordinary views in the country. It's said you can see 13 different counties from up here. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our trip around Broadway. It is a very beautiful place, and you can understand why those extraordinary expat American artists found it so fascinating and so creative. You can find us, remember, on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. But our website is thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk. If you go on there, you'll find everything we've done. We'll be visiting another Cotswold town next month. We'll see you then.